Hello and welcome back to World of Tanks. Today we're going to be taking a first look at the SU-122V, which is an upcoming Tier 8 Soviet tank destroyer. We're going to look at this tank's base statistics, then I'll compare it to a very similar tank that we currently have in the game, and then we'll have a look at this tank's armor model. So stick around to the end because this tank is pretty interesting. So let's get right into it. Let's have a look at this tank's base statistics to start off with. So, the SU-122V is a Tier 8 tank destroyer, and it has a hydro-pneumatic suspension with a mode switch, similar to the Swedish tank destroyers. If any of you have ever played those or seen those be played, it has an identical mechanic to that. So we're getting a kind of Soviet version of an STRV here. And as you look at the statistics, you will also go, that looks very similar to the Swedish tank destroyers. So, DPM, we've got 2673, and that is in siege mode. So remember, this tank is going to have different statistics outside of siege mode than it does in siege mode, but we're going to look at the statistics in siege mode because that's when you're going to be firing the gun the most. So, you've got 2673 DPM, which is pretty nice. That is, it's kind of towards the higher end, but it's kind of middle to low for Tier 8 tank destroyers. It's got 440 alpha. That's quite nice, actually. That is a definite improvement over the STRV's kind of alpha. So you are going to be hitting harder each shot. So we like. Dispersion, 0.24. That's very accurate. This tank is kind of like a laser. You're going to be aiming somewhere, and it's not going to take you very long to aim with 1.44 seconds aim time, and you're going to be hitting where you're aiming, which is very nice. Speed-wise, we will look at speed outside of siege mode. So outside, 50 forwards, 20 back. Inside siege mode, you are limited to 5 kilometers an hour forward, 5 kilometers an hour back, which is very slow. So you are not going to really be able to pull back off ridge lines. You're not really going to be able to approach ridge lines very quickly. So potentially a turbo could mitigate that, and you could probably pick that up to 8 or 9, depending on the type of turbo you're using. But yeah, it's not very quick, to say the least. HP pool is pretty nice. 1200 hit points is, yeah, it's pretty alright, to be fair. It's definitely, on the lower end, but it's definitely better than some tank destroyers at tier 8, for example, the SU. View range, 380 meters. That's really quite nice for a tier 8. That means it's going to be able to spot for itself pretty reliably, so you don't need to use any spotting equipment like optics. It's armor. So, this is with a caveat. This is just effective armor as if you were shooting it at a completely flat angle. So, 80 millimeters. Doesn't look great, but as I said, we'll look at the armor model at the end and I'll show you that is not quite 80 millimeters. So, standard penetration, 252 millimeters standard. That's really nice. You're going to be able to pen most tier 8 heavy tanks pretty reliably. Some tier 8 mediums you may struggle with that, but this tank's heat pen, which is its gold pen, is very nice. 340 millimeters is great. You're going to be able to pen most things. You'll be able to pen tier 10s quite reliably. Only really struggling with tier 10 super heavy armor. And it's got a 2-second mode switch time. So to switch between siege mode and drive mode, you've got 2 seconds. So do always bear that in mind. But let's have a look at this tank's base statistics here compared to the STRV S1, the tier 8 Swedish premium tank, a little bit more closely, so we can see them side by side and see whether this tank is going to be better at some things or worse at some things than the STRV. Well, here we are. SU-122V versus STRV S1. So, let's get straight into it. Statistics, DPM, 2673 versus 2392, SU wins. Alpha, much better for the SU, 430 versus 390. Dispersion, much better for the SU, 0.24 versus 0.29. If any of you have played the S1, it is a little bit of a kind of anomaly from the Swedish tank destroyer line. It is not the most accurate, but 0.29 is still quite accurate. It's just not as accurate as the other tech tree versions. But the SU wins that massively with 0.24 base. That is insane. Aim time, the SDRV wins with 1.37 versus 1.44. Okay, trade-off. Speed, outside of speed mode, outside of turbo mode, forwards identical. In reverse, the S1 wins it because it can drive back almost as quick as it can go forwards. The SU can't do that. It's kind of got a similar mechanic to any other normal tank. In reverse, in 20, However, the SDRV also wins it in siege mode, being able to go 8 base forward and back compared to the SU's 5 forward and back. HP, the SU was winning this by 200. That's a very, very nice increase. View range, the SU is winning this by 30 meters. Once again, the SDRV kind of has to run optics sometimes, especially on some fieldy maps to spot for itself, but 380, you don't need that. Armor, once again, if any of you have played the S1, you know its armor is pretty weak, but when you angle it and use, the tanks, be able to prop the tank up like that, it does get a lot better. We have a similar situation here with the SU. Standard penetration, the S1 has great standard penetration. 288 millimeters is so good. You really don't need to be firing gold, especially when you're fighting same tier tanks. But the SU's 252 millimeters is still very nice. Gold pen, however, the SU does win it with its heat compared to the S1's APCR at 330, 340 versus 330. Much nicer, 340 heat, once again. You'll be able to pen most things and only really struggle with, tier 10 super heavies. And identical mode switch times of 2 seconds between siege mode and drive mode. So, I've kind of hinted at this tank's armor model being a little bit funky, so let's have a look at that. Well, here it is. The armor model using the great tanks.gg. So, this is it looking at live, so as effective as if you were to shoot a shell at it. So, if this tank was to shoot itself with its 252 AP, yeah, that's not 80 millimeters of armor. That's quite angled. Yeah, it may be 80 effective, but yeah, it's pretty angled. This thing's armor, its upper hull armor especially, is going to be pretty effective against most tier 8 tanks. It's angled in such a way that AP just auto ricochets, especially if it's on flat ground. So you are going to want to be firing heat at it. When you do load heat, do bear in mind this thing has ridiculous heat pen of 340. Most tier 8s, I've only got heat pen of around 300. So you're going to be having like a 50-50 chance to be able to pen this thing with heat. Especially on flat ground, that is. Do bear in mind this is flat ground. But, if you are firing AP against this tank, its armor and its gun mantler is weak. So this entire area in here behind the gun is weak, and at its thickest, it's 200 millimeters. So tier 8 and tier 7 tanks are going to be able to reliably pen this, and it's pretty big, and you can shoot it at any angle. It's visible from any angle, pennable from any angle, which is quite nice. What's interesting, this tank's lower plate is just very weak. Yeah. If you're playing this thing, you are very much going to want to be aware of this thing's lower plate being very weak. 90 millimeters stretching down to 160 at the bottom. As you can see, it kind of tapers off. But, if you're just hitting this upper bar, 90 millimeters, it's very weak. But let's put this thing into kind of a situation where it's going to be using its gun depression and going to be, propping the tank up. Obviously, tanks.gg hasn't quite got the mechanic working, but we can kind of imagine it. So imagine like this, that the gun is like this. Yeah. Now we put it against heat. Yeah. This thing's pretty strong, and the gun mantlet becomes a little bit less visible. Obviously, you can still pen it with AP all around, but if you're firing heat, yeah. This thing's cupola is kind of non-existent. Even when it's on flat, its thing's cupola is kind of non-existent because it's really far back and it's pretty low profile. But if it's using its gun depression and you're firing heat, yeah, good luck. It's going to struggle to hide its lower plate. Obviously, it's kind of like a barn door, so it's going to be quite hard to hide. But if it can kind of find a ridgeline where it just sits like this, yeah, this thing might be quite scary. This is going to be struggled to pen by tier 10 things. Yes, it does have its gun mantler, do bear that in mind, and it isn't going to be able to rock back and forth very quickly because it's quite slow, 5 in speed mode, 5 in siege mode. But yeah, thing's pretty scary, to say the least, and it can also kind of bait shots quite nicely. If I pick this tank up when it becomes available, we don't know how it's going to become available. You can kind of do some funky stuff with this kind of reversing this tank out. You can almost side scrape with it, which is very odd for a turretless TD. This plate on most tanks is normally really weak, and it's only 300, It is only 300mm at its finished and, 330, 340 at its thickest. But if you're fighting against tier 8 tanks, no tier 8 tank, apart from, high pen TDs, has that kind of pen. So if you could just take this thing to the city on any map, and, the heavy tanks are going to have like 280mm pen. They're not penning this. They're not penning this. Yes, if they fire heat, they are going to be, so it's going to take, a little bit of knowledge of what shells tanks have. But you're fighting against a tank that has AP, APCR, just laugh. Because you can literally over-angle the armor, like, this much. Like, look at that. That's ridiculous. Like, and, normally you get a shot trap appear here. Yeah, you start to get one appear here. But if you could just put a wall like that, yeah, this tank's armor is a bit funky. It's kind of like a pseudo heavy tank, just like a turretless heavy tank almost, it reminds me of. But with the accuracy of a very, very accurate tank destroyer and the pen of a very, yeah, it's very funky. Yeah. Well, let's go into what I think this tank is going to be like if it does get released like this. So, the SU-122V. This tank is looking quite menacing. Pretty scary, actually. And do bear in mind, these are all Supertest statistics, so they are subject to change. But I wouldn't be shocked if we do see this thing receive a little bit of a nerf, especially to its gun handling prior to release, because, yeah, it's the whole package currently. It has the armor to be able to brawl with heavy tanks. It has the gun to be able to work at range. You could pretty much play this tank however you wanted and probably achieve pretty good results. So, yeah, be a little bit scared of this tank. And, it's likely going to be a loot box tank. Like, tanks at tier 8 like this, they kind of get released through loot boxes. Whether we see it before Christmas, whether we see it, this year, it's all up in the air at the minute. But to say this thing's been in Supertest since January, they are clearly wanting to try this thing out and see what this thing can do. And so far, we've had no changes. But it's going to be interesting to see what this tank looks like when it actually does get released and how it gets released. Potentially some loot boxes in the summer, we could see this thing. But, yeah, that's the SU-122V, my opinions, and a whole overview of this tank. If you did enjoy this video, I will see you in the next one. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye!